Hello and welcome to lecture number 93, historical topic 8.10, the African American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and beyond. The themes are social structures and politics and power. There are two learning objectives. The first learning objective says explain how and why various groups responded to calls for the expansion of civil rights from 1960 to 1980. The first key concept says during and after World War I, civil rights activists and leaders, most notably Martin Luther King Jr., combated racial discrimination utilizing a variety of strategies, including legal challenges, direct action, and nonviolent protest tactics. Martin Luther King Jr. showed up in the previous civil rights lecture. He was involved in the 1954 Montgomery bus boycott and was a major figure in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. King went across the South and organized people to fight against segregation or disenfranchisement. In 1963, he's in Birmingham, Alabama, and is arrested for supposedly organizing a march without a proper permit. While he's in jail, he writes a letter from a Birmingham jail. It justifies the direct action that King and other civil rights leaders were taking. He criticized those who were asking for gradual change and emphasized that the need for change was urgent. The most quoted line from the essay is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Because of his leadership role in the movement and disruptive acts of civil disobedience that he helped plan, he was investigated by the FBI from the 1950s after the Montgomery bus boycott until his assassination in 1968. While Martin Luther King Jr. is now remembered as a moderate, probably incorrectly, his ideas and actions were perceived to be quite radical during this time. The head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, authorized wiretaps and surveillance partly because he thought that he was influenced by communists. In the final years of King's life, the FBI tried to use the allegations of communism to discredit King, and this was confirmed by a congressional committee in the 1970s. King's advocacy for civil rights shifted in the final years of his life, however. His involvement in advocacy in the early 1960s was important for the adoption of major civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1965. By 1967, he published the book, Where Do We Go From Here? In it, he outlined his vision for the future of the movement. He advocated for a shift towards economic justice and the eradication of poverty. He argued that civil rights were meaningless without economic rights. He called for greater government involvement in making this happen, and though it may be controversial, he also called for reparations in the form of financial compensation, educational opportunities, or access to affordable housing to lift Black Americans to greater parity with their white counterparts. Direct action and nonviolent protest tactics were common across the entire civil rights movement. This wasn't just something that Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for. For example, there were sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. The first sit-ins predate the 1960s, but the one that's most often cited is the 1960 Woolworth sit-in in North Carolina. That's because the college students that carried them out went on to form other civil rights groups that advocated for change. As you can see in the pictures, when the sit-ins were carried out, some of the white patrons would harass the black protesters. They'd throw food at them and pour drinks on them. Sometimes it would turn violent and white patrons would beat the protesters and drag them out onto the lunch counter. Through all this, the protesters remained stoic and did not fight back to show their commitment to the nonviolent methods. Wade-ins were very similar in nature. In Biloxi, Mississippi, black beachgoers demanded the right to access the public beaches that were segregated at the time. In a 1960 wade-in, the Biloxi police stood by as white mob attacked the 125 black men, women, and children that attempted to integrate the beach. The day's events were referred to as the Bloody Wade-In. It resulted in the Justice Department filing a suit against the city. However, the case kept getting postponed by the city, and it wasn't until 1968 that the beach opened for the first time to both white and black beachgoers. Freedom rides were attempts to integrate buses on interstate routes. Black and white students would get on a Greyhound bus in the north and would ride down into the southern cities. They were trying to get the local law enforcement to uphold the law in the recent Supreme Court cases that said that there should not be segregation in any interstate transportation. There were actually a series of cases going back to 1946 with Morgan versus Virginia. The two cases that the Freedom Riders were seeking to get enforced were Boynton versus Virginia, which also banned segregation in waiting areas, and Syracuse versus Carolina Coach Company, which made it so private companies also had to ensure equal treatment of passengers. The 1963 March on Washington brought about 200,000 Americans, black and whites, to Washington, D.C. to advocate for greater access to economic opportunities for black Americans. In the top right of the picture, the leaders of the various civil rights movements are photographed with A. Philip Randolph in the middle of the bottom row. He was one of the most important figures in the 1963 Civil Rights March because it was his original vision during the Roosevelt administration to bring this all about. From a practical standpoint, Bayard Rustin was another critical figure for taking care of the organization of the march. It's at this march that King delivered his I Have a Dream speech to his biggest audience yet. It helped push Congress and President Johnson to adopt major civil rights legislation. The next key concept says, continuing resistance slowed efforts at desegregation, sparking social and political unrest across the nation. Debates among civil rights activists over the efficacy of nonviolence increased after 1965. After success in the adoption of civil rights legislation and Supreme Court decisions that guaranteed desegregated education, the civil rights movement started putting the enforcement of these decisions to the test. In some instances, they faced huge resistance from their white communities and state governments. In 1962, a former U.S. Air Force veteran, James Meredith, was trying to attend the University of Mississippi. He was initially rejected by the university on the basis of race. Later, a federal court made the university allow him to register. Meredith, however, faced resistance from the community and the governor of the state, Ross Barnett. In response, the Kennedy administration sent federal troops to ensure that he could enroll. In 1963, Governor George Wallace of Alabama got personally involved when black students Vivian Malone and James Hood attempted to enroll at the University of Alabama. He stood in front of the entrance, physically blocking them from entering the main building. President Kennedy nationalized the Alabama National Guard and got Wallace to step aside. The incident is later referred to as Wallace blocking the schoolhouse door. Wallace continued to resist desegregation in his state. His 1963 election campaign did promise segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, after all. In 1966, 12 years after the Brown decision, he signed a bill that forbade schools to enter into desegregation agreements with the Federal Office of Education. It risked losing $24 million of federal education funding. Resistance to the civil rights movement continued and escalated into violent acts. The Mississippi Freedom Summer refers to a voting registration drive across the state to make the demographics of the voter rolls, 99% white and 1% black, to the demographics of the state, 30% non-white. It was organized by SNCC and CORE, and they sent hundreds of mostly white volunteers from all over the country to register black residents. They faced violent opposition from white supremacist groups like the KKK. 3 of these volunteers, 2 white and 1 black, were abducted, shot, and buried in shallow graves for their activism by the KKK. Their disappearance and murder caused national outrage that brought on an FBI investigation. In 1965, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized a 54-mile march across Alabama. They were aiming to promote voting rights for the people of Alabama. Peaceful marchers led by John Lewis of SNCC and Reverend Hosea Williams of the SCLC were met by police when they attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The police beat the marchers with nightsticks and launched tear gas. The events were televised to the rest of the country and was an influential moment in building up support for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1963, the prominent civil rights activist in Mississippi, Medgar Evers, was assassinated. He was shot outside of his home after arriving from a late night of working at the NAACP offices. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was also assassinated. The night before he was assassinated, he spoke to a crowd and had mentioned the threats on his life. In a prophetic moment, he summarized the gains of the movement and predicted that he may not live to see the realization of the work that they were doing. The last paragraph of his speech, now known as the Mountaintop Speech, goes as follows. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up to that mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Those were his last public words before he was assassinated the next day. The backlash against the civil rights continues in the 1968 presidential election. George Wallace, the same George Wallace that stood in front of the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to keep black students from registering, runs for president through the third party, the American Independent Party. He received 46 electoral votes, all from the Deep South. This result showed that Americans, especially in the South, were not quite ready to accept this new wave of equality. As the 1960s progressed, various civil rights groups were formed that had bigger diversity in their ideology and methods. Up until this point of the movement, peaceful protest and acts of civil disobedience have been the prevailing methods. This doesn't go away. In 1960, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was formed. Ella Baker, John Lewis, Stockley Carmichael were the main figures inside of SNCC. Carmichael later broke away from SNCC to expand on his own ideas on black power that stressed separatism. The Nation of Islam, created by Elijah Muhammad, also advocated for the separation of black and white Americans. Its most visible member was Malcolm X. They advocated for the creation of a black nation as the U.S. government had proved to be inherently racist. They promoted self-reliance and economic empowerment within the black community. Violence was acceptable in matters of self-defense against white violence, and because of that, they were viewed as inherently violent and dangerous. However, they were not entirely shunned. In fact, one of the most famous Americans of the 1960s converted to join the Nation of Islam, and that was Muhammad Ali. Malcolm X would later split from the Nation of Islam. He had initially criticized the mainstream civil rights movement for being too focused on integration. He thought they should embrace their own culture and identity as opposed to try to assimilate with white society. Towards the end of his life, he actually began to shift an ideology on violence and advocated a more inclusive vision of black liberation with white allies. The Black Panthers were a revolutionary socialist group that formed in response to police brutality and continued institutional racism. The founders were Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, and they formed in Oakland in 1966. They also expanded to have chapters in cities across the United States. They advocated self-rule and black separatism. Similarly to the Nation of Islam, they're seen as more violent than the mainstream civil rights movement. This is because they also supported armed self-defense and community policing. In addition to that, they also held Marxist and Leninist ideas that promoted a revolution. Through the 1960s, riots also became more common. The 1965 Watts riot in the Los Angeles area started in response to a traffic stop where a black motorist failed the sobriety test. The arrest for the stop then turned violent. After a community meeting failed to calm tensions, the LA Police Department chief called in the National Guard. It escalated resistance, and over the 6 days of riots, 50 square miles of Los Angeles were engulfed. An estimated 34,000 people were involved, and it produced 34 deaths, the destruction of 1,000 buildings, and $40 million in damages. The 1967 Detroit riots were just as large. In the summer of 1967, Detroit police moved to shut down an illegal after-hours club in a black neighborhood. When the police finished arresting the patrons of the club and putting them in cars, a crowd had gathered. After an hour of observing, bottles were thrown at police and violence breaks out. The mayor of Detroit called in the National Guard as the riots escalated. After 5 days of rioting, 43 people died and 1,400 buildings had been set on fire. Then in 1968, nationwide riots engulfed the country in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Over 100 cities across the country saw unrest, with the biggest riots happening in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago, and Kansas City. The second learning objective says, explain the various ways in which the federal government responded to the calls for the expansion of civil rights. This is the part of LBJ's Great Society policy programs that deals with racial issues. The first key concept says, 3 branches of the federal government use measures including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to promote greater racial equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made segregation in public facilities illegal. That includes bus stops, restaurants, hotels, and any other place that engages in interstate commerce. Congress used its power to regulate interstate commerce to justify its enforcing of civil rights. The government now had more power to enforce these policies too. It created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which monitored discrimination in employment. It allowed employees to file grievances for being discriminated against in the workplace. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. It eliminated literacy tests as a requirement to register to vote, and it gave power to the Justice Department to step in and register African Americans who had been living in areas where their suffrage had been suppressed. Again, the inspiration for this piece of legislation was the police violence on the peaceful protesters at the Selma March. The U.S. also ratified the 24th Amendment in 1964, which eliminated the poll tax, another tool that was used to disenfranchise black voters. The last key concept of the lecture says, a series of Supreme Court decisions expanded civil rights and individual liberties. Here's a long list of Supreme Court cases and short definitions in the way that they aim to expand civil rights. Baker v. Carr ended gerrymandering on the basis of race. Gerrymandering is the practice of drawing representative districts to benefit one party over the other. Green v. New Kent County in 1968 said that using school choice programs was not sufficient enough to comply with the desegregation orders. School districts needed to be more active in providing options to black students to be able to attend white schools or previously white majority schools. Alexander v. Holmes County is probably the most significant court case in this list. In 1969, 15 years after the Brown Supreme Court decision, the court said that enough was enough. Too much time has passed by and there's still not considerable progress in the degree of desegregation in schools. They called for immediate desegregation of the nation's schools to happen in the upcoming school year, and it is the reason why the greatest amount of school desegregation happened during the Nixon administration. Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg allowed the use of busing for desegregation, and in 1974, the reversal of some of these desegregation policies began with Milliken v. Bradley. It prohibited the use of inter-district busing as a tool for desegregation. It allowed suburban districts to remain majority white and urban districts to be majority minority. Finally, here's the recap. Martin Luther King Jr. was the most visible civil rights leader. He inspired through the rhetoric he used in his essays, like Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and speeches like the I Have a Dream speech, which he delivered in the 1963 March on Washington. There was resistance to progress in civil rights, particularly from the Deep South. The civil rights groups were also not entirely unified in their approach. Legislative victories for the movement include the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And there's also judicial victories with Alexander versus Holmes and Baker versus Carr. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.